Well, I'm glad to be with you this morning on this 69th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I want to acknowledge up front that this declaration has its critics, and for me, I am more comfortable framing them as a set of universal aspirations, and my concern is that by claiming them rights, we risk imposing Western culture on the rest of the world. So we need to approach this document with some caution. This morning I chose as a theme citizenship and superpower. And I am a citizen born here in these United States. In the first decade of my life, if you were to ask me about superpower, I probably would have responded with Superman. I was a big fan in the 70s of Superman and Clark Kent and Christopher Reeve, and that's what superpower meant. That began to shift in the second decade of my life. I grew up in the Cold War amidst the stockpiling of nuclear weapons. I remember in the 80s when those stockpiles peaked, there was a program broadcast nationally called The Day After. And I sat on my living room couch, couldn't have been more than 12 years old, and watched what the world could become in a cataclysmic nuclear exchange. I think that was a turning point for me in my understanding of superpower. And the language of megatonnage and megadeath entered my vocabulary as I came to grapple with the capacity that my nation, the East United States, had to end the world as we know it. Also, in the second decade of my life, I was faced with the decision whether or not to register for selective service. I turned 18. My father volunteered to serve in the U.S. military during Vietnam. Told me that it was my duty as a citizen and as a man to register for selective service. Now, I had learned a thing or two about Vietnam growing up, the son of a Vietnam veteran. And I had other influences in my life. I had read Thoreau and I had been to Walden Pond. And I decided that my first act of civil disobedience would be to refuse to register for selective service. At the time, I understood myself to be a pacifist. I was a vegetarian from the age of 14 and saw that as a way to embody my commitment to respect for life of all kinds. I refused to register for selective service in violation of federal law and in disobedience to my father's wishes. But towards the end of that decade, the United States went to war to rescue Kuwait. And throughout the next 20 years, the third and fourth decade of my life, my country has been engaged in what Andrew Bacevich would call the war for the greater Middle East. A war that he says, Andrew Bacevich, a military historian, dates back to 1980 and the Carter Doctrine, but has led to our current expeditionary wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was in seminary at the time of September 11th. My classmate was a Tutsi from Rwanda who had survived the genocide. My relationship with him challenged me to re-examine my commitments about use of force. And I had to admit to myself that these United States, this superpower nation that has tremendous military capacity, could have intervened in that country and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Maybe one deployment of the 101st Airborne to Rwanda. This country could have intervened, but didn't. And I had to accept that there, for me, may be a time for the use of lethal force. But I wondered then and continue to wonder now when that time is. But I decided that I was wrong to refuse to register for selective service. As I saw a generation go off to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, many of them without access that I had, the privilege that I had to education. Many of these young men and women were less educated, were from ethnic minority groups, were without opportunity to go to school or to get a well-paying job or to get health care. And they made up the 1% that this country sent to Iraq and to Afghanistan. And there was something about that that didn't feel right to me. So I volunteered. And it took me a couple of years because I had to request a waiver for refusing to register for selective service. A moral waiver at that. I was issued a moral waiver at a time when the Army was handing out waivers left and right to fill the ranks, to go on these extended deployments. I volunteered and I entered the Army as a chaplain. I served for 5 years as a chaplain and spent a good part of 2012 into 2013 in Afghanistan. I'll share two things about my military experience that I'm proud of. One is in Kandahar, I started a Unitarian Universalist congregation at Kandahar Airfield. The UU World covered it. We met in the beginning, it was just me and my chaplain assistant on a Sunday morning, big military installation, 20,000 people there. But over time it grew, and we never had more than 15 people on a Sunday morning, but we were a community. And it helped me get through some tough times. And my biggest concern about joining the military was that I would lose myself within the military machine. But that community grounded me in my covenantal commitments to be a steward of this tradition as a chaplain endorsed by the Unitarian Universalist Association. I gave a sermon in that congregation on Veterans Day in 2012. It was, in a way, shining light on Superpower's shadow. You can read the sermon, it's online. It's called the Veterans Day Confession for America. That sermon led to an investigation. I was investigated while still deployed. I had to get a trial defense lawyer in Kandahar. And after 2 months, I was formally reprimanded for politically inflammatory speech, handed a do not promote evaluation, and released from active duty. I'm proud of that experience because I didn't lose my soul in the midst of the military machine, but stood with integrity for our principles. And perhaps more specifically, our statement of conscience called Creating Peace. You may not know it. If you don't, I wish you would learn it. It was passed by our General Assembly in 2010. And there's a part of that statement of conscience that challenges us to engage superpower. It goes like this: we repudiate aggressive and preventive wars, the disproportionate use of force, covert wars, and the indiscriminate targeting that kills civilians. Well, I witnessed all of that in Afghanistan. And who would I be if I remained silent? The second thing I'm proud about in my military service is that I didn't give in to the retaliation and the sabotage that I endured after standing up for my convictions. I pushed back with the congressional inquiry and eventually won the support of a few people in the Chief of Chaplain's office at the Pentagon, and I was promoted and reassigned. So I decided to stay in, and I did for 3 more years, with the hope that the issues that I had spoken about, specifically the US drone wars, the expansive powers that have been given to the executive branch of the government to wage war on a global battlefield. I held out the hope that under the Obama administration, things would be different, that there would be transparency, that there would be accountability, that he would follow through on his promise to work for disarmament of our nuclear arsenal. But after 3 years, these dreams were unfulfilled, and I felt betrayed. I concluded that I could no longer serve with integrity as an officer in the United States Army, and I submitted a public resignation in protest. That was last April. So my journey over the 45 years of my life have brought me into contact with superpower. I've been to the Fort Drums and the Fort Bliss's, Texas, Fort Bragg in North Carolina. I've stood on the shores of the most militarized strip of land in the world at Norfolk, gazed out at our aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines that are an integral part of America's global power projection. I've ridden in the Black Hawks, in the C-17s, and I've lived on the remote forward operating bases of our military complex. Some of the many, more than 800 installations that the United States has now set up across the world. We've garrisoned the globe. I've gotten a glimpse into what this superpower looks like, and I feel an imperative to talk about it. The U.S. today has the most powerful military in the history of the world and spends approximately the same amount of money on its military as the next 7 largest government military spenders combined. The total expenditure in the past decade has at times surpassed $700 billion, more than any amount during the Cold War. With this budget, the U.S. keeps more aircraft carriers in its service than do all other countries of the world combined, has more military bases abroad than do all countries of the world combined, has more launch-ready nuclear weapons in its possession than do all other nations of the world combined. And despite the end of the Cold War and the drawdown in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. annual defense budget continues at unprecedented heights. Although U.S. sanctioned violence has contributed directly to the deaths of millions of people, few citizens seem to care about the consequences of our military actions abroad. Beyond the death, the mega death, there are those who live with the imminent threat of death. Nuclear weapons set to launch on ready, launch on warning. First strike authorization granted to the commander-in-chief. The president, by his sole discretion, can unleash a barrage of nuclear weapons that could end the world as we know it. This creates a state of chronic anxiety that many of us cannot face squarely, so we avoid it. But it causes immeasurable psychic suffering to those who choose to be awake and pay attention. Further suffering is caused by covert warfare, remotely piloted drones hovering over communities where residents live, uncertain of when or where the next Hellfire missile will strike, or commandos, special operations commandos, will kick down doors in the middle of night and capture loved ones on routine night raids. Last year, the U.S. dropped 26,162 bombs in 7 nations. That's a measure of superpower. I want to talk about democracy for a moment. The idea of human rights and the Declaration, especially Article 21, it reads this: the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. Implies democracy is necessary for human rights. This book by Sheldon Wolin, called Democracy, Inc., Managed Democracy and the Specter of Inverted Totalitarianism, is a sobering read and has helped me come to terms with the state of U.S. democracy. How can we allow superpower to do what superpower is doing? Wolin says, superpower is the union of state and corporation in an age of waning democracy and political illiteracy. Superpower locates the citizen to spectator. And asks, Can the citizen relearn the demands that democracy places on its highest, most difficult office, not as commonly supposed on the office of the president, but on that of the citizen? The reinvigoration of citizenship necessitates a reordering of basic power arrangements and a different understanding of civic commitment from that of a spectator. Democratic citizens create and sustain healthy democracies. In our congregations, we covenant to affirm and promote a democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. For me, I take that as a charge, as an obligation to reinvigorate citizenship and restrain superpower. For me, that work begins right here, right now, in religious communities like this one, where we reject the role of spectator, turn away from the temptation of sophisticated resignation, what Forest Church calls the great sin of Unitarian Universalism, sophisticated resignation, and counter the cultural trend towards a privatized religion and spirituality freed from accountable community, and reclaim our prophetic witness in the public square.
We invite you now to rise in body or spirit to sing hymn number 298, Wake Up Now My Senses.
Wake
weekend, we make an offering from the bounty we are blessed to enjoy. We do this in a spirit of generosity, aware that we have benefited from those who have gone before, those who in their turn gave generously. The offering goes to support the mission of our congregation, to seek, connect, act, and love. This month's our Share the Plate recipient is the Cortland Emergency Food Bank. If you are visiting, there is no expectation that you participate. You may consider yourself our guest. For those of us who regularly participate in building and who also then benefit from this congregation, we ask you to remember that it is your regular and sustained giving that makes this congregation work. Please give generously. The offering will now be given and gratefully received. We invite you to say the words of our dedication for this offering. They should be printed in your order of service. May these gifts and the work of our hands and hearts give power to all we stand for as a community of faith.
We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment, the fire like Susan B. Anthony, the heart on fire. As we leave this place, take that fire with you and remember the warmth of this place.